The week one main slate is in just a few short days. And so you guys know the drill. It is the block party show. Myself and Jmtowin from 1 week season. I pepper him with questions about the slate. We'll do an overview of all the games, what we're looking at, all of those pieces. Then we'll go position by position, see what is standing out to JM after all of his research at the beginning of the week. And then we will build a lineup on DraftKings using some of JM's favorite building blocks that he outlines each and every week at 1 week season. I'm Pete. This is the block party. We're back.
Peter's one of the greatest depositors I've ever seen.
Trust the process. Let's go.
I got auto match with Levitan. Bullshit.
I just go the other way. In that 66, I win all the money. All the money.
If I had 150 lineups, I'd win too.
AP, crash 5 bullets in your head like KD. Bust it, bitch, go bust it. And I had 10 pints with me in Russia.
Hey, everyone.
All right, JM, we're back. It feels so long in between our last, week 17 slate and week 1 of 2024. How you doing, man?
I am doing great, Pete. How are you?
I'm doing good. We actually did get together last Monday for a best ball draft. So that was fun to get some of your initial thoughts. And I should say too, if you want to go back and watch that, JM talked a lot about kind of the overall NFL landscape, maybe some trends, some teams he's interested in. But today, JM, we're going to dig into the nitty gritty. We're rolling up our sleeves, getting right into the week 1 slate.
Yeah, I first off, that podcast, it was this morning that I remembered that we did that. August is always kind of crazy for both of us getting everything set up for the season. So just this morning, I was like, oh yeah, I already did a podcast with Pete recently. So yeah, man, excited to dive in. We are recording this on Wednesday, but this is week 1. So I'm very far ahead in my thoughts. And we were talking before the show and you were asking how we wanted to run the show. And I said, I'm basically in Friday, Saturday, mid-season mode. So yeah, very ready for this slate, very unique slate because week 1 is always unique, but then week 1 is also unique year to year and what the edges are. So yeah, a lot of unknowns across the NFL landscape. And so those of you who are new to this show, one of the things that we want to pick up throughout our discussions here is that DFS is not a game of predicting what we think is going to happen, but of understanding probabilities and positioning ourselves for the most plus EV, most positive expected outcome decisions we can make. So yeah, there's some interesting ways to handle week 1, given the volume of unknowns this week and how we can make plus EV decisions around that. Everything's about first place finishes. So how to maximize our chance at one of those first place finishes.
And one thing I do want to mention here right at the top, because we are going to be talking about a lot of the 1 week season content. I know a lot of you guys have taken the plunge, have loved it. Lots of returning customers who love coming back to 1 week season. If you do want to try it out, this is the week to do it completely free at 1 week season. Go get an account over there. Check out all of the stuff, the scroll. We're going to hit on a bunch of the content throughout the show. So make sure you guys get signed up there. And then going forward, obviously you got to pay the piper eventually, but when you do, promo code Pete will get you the 20% off there. Jam, am I missing anything else as far as the free week and the future promos?
No, this is a good time for me to always say what I always say, which is that we don't build OWS to be for everybody. We build it to be for a specific type of DFS player who wants to see the game a particular way. And so because we build it for a specific type of player, if you are that specific type of player, you tend to really connect with the site. It's very different from what you'll get anywhere else. If you're not that type of player, you'll quickly realize that OWS isn't a fit for you. There's a lot of great content out there, so go find a different home. But we make everything free week 1 to give people a chance to check it out, see if it is a fit for them. If it's a fit for you, it's probably a fit all the way. If it's not a fit, then it's not going to change over time. And so pick up some learning and some stuff that you can add to your game in this podcast each week. Go somewhere else for your week-to-week content. But yeah, check out OWS week 1, always free week 1.
All right, let's dive in. I'm going to pull up the slate overview here. You guys have a nice little screener on 1 week season where we can get a quick overview of the main slate matchups and the implied team totals here. We do have 12 games, some juicy team totals, some premier matchups. What was your first kind of take when you reviewed this slate here? Did you get excited? Did you feel overwhelmed? What are we looking at here on week 1?
Pete, would you be surprised to know that this is the first time I've looked at these over-unders at any point in my process?
Really?
I very much enter things from kind of the ground floor in. And so I don't necessarily, obviously, when I write the Angles email, I have to take a a macro view because I kind of look at the game totals and write things up in that way. Actually, I'm not writing the Angles email this year. Larejo is, so that'll actually spare me from even having to look at the game totals at that point. But I very much like to kind of enter the landscape and get a feel for the landscape on the ground, boots on the ground. So I really entered this slate like any other slate where you kind of go game by game. You get a sense of the pricing at the positions. You get a sense of what the unknowns are. You get a sense of what game environments might stand out and how different game environments might develop. And that sort of informs my player pool. And so, this week, really no different from any other week. Every week has its own unique questions, its own unique set of problems. And so this week has a unique set of problems, but there were I wouldn't say any emotions tied to it of feeling overwhelmed or feeling like things were really obvious, right? It was just like, okay, this is a week like any other week, and it's going to have its own set of problems. And it does have its own set of problems because there's so many spots that you could paint a viable picture of how this game becomes a had to have it type of game because of the like exponential number of unknowns that we have, not just in any given week one, but this particular year. Like almost every team has changed something, often something significant, whether it's main weapons or whether it's quarterback or whether it's offensive system or whether it's head coach. And so, there's just a broad range of potential outcomes. And so then the question is, how do I maximize my chances of getting to a first place finish? This is what we always talk about. You guys will get sick of hearing us talk about it on this show, but that's also why we get so many first place finishes in the OWS community, because that's how we think, that's how we build our rosters. And so there's a unique approach I'm taking this week in that I'm actually going to stack a lot more offenses than I typically stack, as in like the total number of like 4% of this quarterback, 6% of this quarterback, probably going to be higher than normal. The total number of like 4%, 6% wide receivers is going to be higher than normal. But what we also always want is that roster staple where it's like, a very easy example was last year when Cooper Kupp was still really cheap and that entire offense ran through Kupp and Nakua and Kyron Williams. And it was like 1 to 2 of these guys is going to score 30 plus DraftKings points every week. And so you can just mix and match them across 80% of your rosters. Actually, I think that week I did 100% of my rosters had some mix and match from that pool. And you know that a big chunk of your rosters are now going to be set. So as you're throwing all these darts around it, you have like a chunk of your rosters that's definitely getting points. So this year, the way that week one, the way that I'm looking to build this chunk of rosters is there's like a handful of high confidence players, some of them really obvious, and then some of them a little bit less obvious, which is great because they'll be lower owned. And if I'm right on what I'm seeing, then that really elevates my floor. And then you get kind of those solid points mixing and matching across a bunch of rosters, and then throw all these, myriad darts around that. So that's kind of how I'm seeing week one, is like a somewhat solid core of like main guys I'm going to focus on for those points. That's going to hopefully lock in like a bunch of my rosters have 2 or 3 of these guys that are all getting points. And then we throw the darts around that.
So that kind of more bottom-up approach, how much is that fueled, do you think, by the fact that these salaries were set a while ago? There's definitely some mispriced things based on new information that we've received, since those salaries came out. Or in general, do you like approaching things from that kind of granular level? Because I think a lot of people, they'll pull up the calendar and they'll be like, oh, I like this Bills Cardinals game. I like this Jags Dolphins game. Let me start building there. How do you weigh those two elements of like game environments and then this guy's mispriced, or I like this cheap block of players, and then I'll go from there?
Yeah, I love that question. I ran a couple Q&A podcasts on the 1 Week Season podcast feed. If any of you want to listen to it, just search 1 Week Season on your favorite podcast player. The first Q&A went up this morning. Second goes up tomorrow. I've recorded both of them. And there were some questions in there about some cheap players. And one of the things that I talked about in those was, we don't want to just think about, is this guy cheap and maybe has a bigger role than people expect, but also what do you get when you get him right? And so is his range of scoring 8 to 15 points at this 3K, 4K price tag? In which case, like, fine, if you get that score, you're pretty happy, right? But if you don't have that score, you're not chasing those rosters. You're not saying, man, I had no chance of competing this weekend because I don't have that 15-point score from this cheap guy, right? So you also want to think about, what is the actual ceiling on some of these guys? So last year, late August, you remember this, Pete, I was super high on Tank Dell and I was super high on Puka Nacua. And then we come into week one and those guys are really cheap and people aren't on them. Well, this year I very much came into week one thinking, man, we might get, who am I going to find in August that's my Tank Dell and my Puka Nacua this year? And I haven't found anybody, right? Not every year yields us one of those. And so just because a player is underpriced doesn't mean that they're definitely going to go for the type of score that you had to have. Like Roma Dunze, who I like this week, and I'll have some Roma Dunze exposure, but I think at 4K, he's going to stand out to so many people as like, man, this guy's so talented and he's on this offense everybody's been talking about all offseason. He's only 4K. He's also the number 3 wide receiver on this offense, right? And so what are the chances of him putting up 25 points? Can he do it? Absolutely. That's why I'll have some exposure. Is he going to put up, in this exact scenario, is he going to put up 25 points 4, 5, 6 times throughout the season to where then he's just like a screaming value at 4K? Probably not, right? And so I'm going to have exposure to Rome Odunze, but he's not going to be one of my staple plays because we also want to recognize that price isn't the only component. I think you asked about the Dolphins Jags game, the Bills Cardinals games. I think those are two of the games that probably should stand out to us, at the top of mind. And so without looking at these implied team totals, that's obviously a couple places where my mind already was in terms of where we can find these much more solid sets of points. So lots of things to go through on a week like this, but we always still want to be thinking about what is the raw score that a player can put up. Salary multipliers are great, but also, any player who can put up 30 plus points is a player we want to consider, and that's regardless of price tag. And if a player doesn't have that within his range, they should be moving down our list a little bit.
Yeah, it's a good point. I'm glad you brought up the Rome one because I think there's an element this year, and I'm obviously in a best ball bubble, but one things we talked about even when we were drafting our redraft teams is like we have this best ball brain, and now we need to kind of shift over for a different contest format. I do wonder with best ball exploding this year, if some of those like fun, sexy guys we've been drafting all summer long who like pop off the page at 4K or like, Brian Thomas or AD Mitchell or all these guys who we're drafting them because of what we think they can mostly do weeks 15 through 17 in those playoff weeks. I wonder if that best ball brain spills over a little more than in previous years to week 1 DFS to the point that some of those rookies are maybe a little overowned relative to the realistic score they can put up, like you mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, every rookie wide receiver besides Jalen Polk features heavily on my week 1 list. And then when I was kind of putting in my initial exposure percentages, I had to ask tougher questions of like, okay, but what is their ceiling really, right? Like how many passes is Anthony Richardson going to throw? Sure. And then how many of them are really going to AD Mitchell? What are the chances of Brian Thomas Jr. at 4,700 putting up a 25-point score, right? Like what are the chances of him being involved, maybe putting up 13 to 15 to 16 points? Probably pretty high, but what are the chances of him putting up a score that if you don't have him, you're like, oh man, I'm really behind the field now because I don't have him on these rosters. So then you have to adjust your exposures accordingly. So even Malik Nabers, right, 5,900. And you're talking, what I like about Malik Nabers is you're getting an unquestioned alpha wide receiver. So in these other spots, you're getting a number 2 guy, a number 3 guy. With Malik Nabers, you're getting an unquestioned number 1 wide receiver, but you still have Daniel Jones throwing him the ball and the unknowns of like, what is his week-to-week consistency in this offense? Obviously, we know he's going to have some ceiling. He's going to have some big games. But when he's not hitting a big game, is he getting 8 to 12 points, right? And so kind of having to balance all these rookie wide receivers of like, yeah, there's some things to be excited about here. And this is Wednesday. These things will change, but probably not dramatically. Right now, I've got Odunze at like 10% exposure. I've got Brian Thomas Jr. at 4% exposure. I have AD Mitchell at 8% exposure. So kind of in this range of like, yeah, I want to get exposure. I have Malik Nabers at 14%. Originally, I had him a little bit higher, and then it was like, okay, but there is this inconsistent factor of Daniel Jones. And if I had a smaller wide receiver list, these numbers would be bumped up. If I had a smaller wide receiver list, though, Brian Thomas Jr. might not be on the list, right? So that's kind of the function of week 1 is recognizing that these rookies are always going to kind of stand out. And most of the time, they're not going to put up a tournament winning game. So recognize that, just because they're a shiny new toy doesn't mean that they're actually going to hit, but everybody's going to lean into them because the emotional vibes towards those players aren't sullied by what they've done to us in the past.
For sure. Yeah. And again, too, like the flip side of my thing about these rookie wide receivers, or maybe they're slightly overvalued week 1, this is also an incredible crop of rookie wide receivers. Like it's a deeper year than we've had in a long time. So we got to weigh all of those factors here. I say we dive right in and go to the quarterback position. I am going to just pull up the DraftKings kind of lobby here just so we can kind of scroll through salaries as we go. Of course, everyone can see Josh Allen at the top at 8K. We have tons of premium options, CJ Stroud. We can talk about Trevor Lawrence, Anthony Richardson. At the top end of the QB position, what stood out to you? And obviously people who clicked on this video did notice the Josh Allen cover boy by now.
Yeah, so Josh Allen is one of these players that I'm going to have heavy exposure to across my rosters. And so I'm going to have a large chunk of Josh Allen rosters to basically say like, yes, I'm taking shots on a bunch of different quarterbacks, but my main bet This week 1 is Josh Allen. So it's going to be anywhere from like 24 to 36% of my rosters. And it would be higher. Like if I were just eyeballing this slate, I would say, man, and maybe I'll end up here, but I would have said like, man, Josh Allen, 50% of my rosters, the other 50% mix and match other things. Then there were so many quarterbacks I wanted to hit on, and some of them that I wanted to get like 10% to 12% of, that it kind of takes away. Actually, one guy who I want to get 18% of. So we'll see where these exposures kind of move around from here. But yeah, I think that Josh Allen, we look at last year, 19 games, including playoffs. He scored, I think it was 26, 27 plus DraftKings points in 7 of those 19 games. And just comparing like what you get from a salary spent standpoint to likelihood of 30 plus points, he matches up with Justin Jefferson, matches up with Tyreek Hill. Like if you're spending 8K plus in salary, you want it to be a guy who not only can put up one of these types of scores, but can do it consistently and can kind of do it on his own. And so Josh Allen is kind of top of the pile for me at the quarterback position. And what really pushes him up is, we talk about this sometimes throughout the season, the stack prices on a quarterback is actually more important than the individual price on a quarterback. So the stack price on Josh Allen is cheaper than the stack price on Sam Darnold. The stack price on Josh Allen is cheaper than the stack price on Gardner Minshew. And so when we look at, you have to add one of Josh Allen's pass catchers with him. If you go to Dalton Kincaid, then the price is a little bit more similar because he's a little bit more expensive. But generally speaking, you're spending like $13K for a Josh Allen stack. You're spending like $13.5K for, I guess it's $12.9K for a Gardner Minshew stack. So right in that Josh Allen range, 13.6 for Sam Darnold and Justin Jefferson, excuse me. So, recognizing that the stack price of a Josh Allen stack still brings him down, right? And you have this high floor on Josh Allen. And then the question becomes, well, that second bet down the line, yes, you get Josh Allen right, but now you have to get the correct stacking partner, right? And that's where it kind of cuts down on the percentage chance of getting this right, because your percentage chance of getting Josh Allen right are higher than most other players on the slate. But then that second bet down the line, the percentages get cut down a little bit because you have to get the stacking partner right. I actually think we know who the ideal stacking partner will be. So that kind of influences my decision a little bit as well. But yeah, that's how I see the quarterback position at the very top.
Yeah. And then, kind of looking, just at some early stuff as far as value, it does seem like there are a lot of value quarterbacks. So do you think this is a tough decision as far as, do you pay up for Josh Allen or do you go down to one of these, say, 6,300 and lower guys? It sounds like you'll be spreading around your exposures, but where do you see kind of the optimal path at quarterback this week?
Yeah, and I think that even if you're not an MME player, like most people are building 3 rosters, they're building 5 rosters. So you still want to take this type of thinking, right? Of okay, if I'm building 5 rosters, I want 2 Josh Allen rosters, and then I want my other 3 kind of spread among these other guys. But yeah, I see very much kind of this 6.2, 6.3K and below. And there's things that stand out about all these guys, right? Trevor Lawrence could put up a 30-point game in what looks like it could develop into a really nice game environment. Kirk Cousins could put up 30 plus points. He's a guy who does that way more frequently than a lot of people give him credit for. Really, the matchup against Pittsburgh is the one thing that draws it back a little bit, but he's playing in Atlanta. Pittsburgh secondary sometimes has some issues, especially early in the season. Geno Smith, in this Ryan Grubb offense where they want to be more vertical, like, would it surprise us if he comes out and puts up a really nice game? Maybe they don't need the opponent to push the scoring the way that the old Seahawks team needed to under Pete Carroll. So there's just a lot of these guys under here. I'll tell you the main guys. These are the 4 guys who I have mapped out for like ideally 8% or higher ownership on my end. It is Anthony Richardson, because you just get that rushing upside. He's basically, a running back who's going to throw the ball probably probably 25 times. And we also look at what Shane Steichen has done with Justin Herbert early in Herbert's career, with Jalen Hurts when Jalen Hurts was supposed to be, a second-round quarterback who wasn't ever really going to emerge as an elite starter. With Gardner Minshew last year, right? He always changes his offense to adapt to the strengths and skill sets of his quarterback. And so there's definitely going to be a lot of big Anthony Richardson games this year. He's a guy I want to be on. Jayden Daniels, just because of the rushing upside, especially rookie in his first game, not facing the best defense in the world, and has this rushing upside. Well, a lot of times these rookies in their first game are going to kind of leak out of the pocket more frequently. That could lead to more sacks, which means more killed drives, which means lower scoring, but it could also mean more big rushes. So Jayden Daniels, another guy. Sam Darnold, because we saw Nick Mullins last year in 3 out of 4 starts go for 22 plus DraftKings points in this offense. We saw Josh Dobbs do what he did in this offense. We know what Kevin O'Connell is capable of. You still have Justin Jefferson. So I think Sam Darnold's going to end up being a really sharp play. And that Sam Darnold, Justin Jefferson stack is really going to compete with these Josh Allen stacks. And then the one that I'll save the other one. I'll save the other one until we get to the building blocks. Okay, so those are the quarterbacks we'll talk about for now.
Yeah.
We'll tease the other one for later.
Let me ask you real quick about Anthony Richardson, Jayden Daniels. You mentioned kind of the Josh Allen dynamic, kind of having a stacking partner to make it work. Richardson and Daniels, obviously people very aware that a lot of the selling point with those guys is the rushing upside, not necessarily needing the stacking partner. Are those guys you would play naked, as we say in the biz, or would you still be dialing up at least a skinny stack with those guys?
Yeah, so it's very rare that playing a quarterback naked is actually optimal, as in it's hard to guess which guy is going to hit. And so it seems like, well, I should just play him naked, but then he's going to connect with somebody, and somebody that you're competing against in tournaments is going to have that correct stacking piece. And so you have to be thinking about that. Anthony Richardson is one of the rare situations where he can go for 30 plus points and not pull anybody else up with him, because they can really limit that passing volume. Michael Pittman's going to be kind of the main guy, but Michael Pittman's not a big play guy. He's a guy who needs to pile up targets. He's in a tougher matchup. And so then the question really becomes like, maybe the question becomes, how many swings do I want to take on pass catchers? Because I'm definitely going to have some Anthony Richardson naked. With Jayden Daniels, I look at Terry McLaurin as this guy who's capable of commanding double-digit targets. I look at Cliff Kingsbury as a coach who's comfortable drawing up double-digit targets for an individual player. And I look at Terry McLaurin and his price tag as one of these guys who it's like, man, this team has nothing, right? Noah Brown, who obviously had a couple huge games last year, never had more than 550 receiving yards in a season in his career, but got cut by the Texans because he was their number 6 weapon or their number 4 weapon, but they got to keep Robert Woods because he's their veteran leader, and they got to keep John Mechie because they see his upside. But it's like he got cut, and really either week 1 or week 2 or week 3, like he's going to be the number 2 receiver on Washington, right? That's how thin they are. Zach Ertz is their tight end. So I just think that Terry McLaurin, we could see him really piling up targets in this offense. So I like the Jayden Daniels, Terry McLaurin stack. Might run a couple naked or a couple with Ertz or something like that. But that's one where I would rather go with the stacking partner for sure.
One other quarterback I want to ask you about before we move on to running backs is Caleb Williams. You know, he's such an interesting one. Obviously, incredible prospect. This game has a pretty good total. You know, the Bears are projected to score a decent amount of points, and yet it's still a rookie. It's still his first game. It's still Shane Waldron, who we saw kind of neutering an offense in Seattle last year. Is Caleb Williams on the menu for you at all?
Yeah, he's on the menu, but he's kind of one of these lower percentage exposure guys, and maybe that'll come back to bite me. I've been kind of tamping down, excitement on Caleb Williams because I always think about how a team wants to try to win games, right? The Buffalo Bills last year scored 30 plus points 7 times. There was only one of those 7 games in which the opponent was anywhere close to them on the scoreboard. So the Buffalo Bills are one of these rare teams. It's like, we don't care what the opponent's doing. We're willing to go out and score points. This is another reason I like Josh Allen this week, right? Because Arizona, PFF has the Arizona defense ranked 32nd on the defensive line, 32nd in the linebacking unit, 32nd in the secondary. And the Bills don't need the Cardinals to be scoring points in order to score points themselves, right? It's just such high probability outcomes there. Whereas if you're the Bears, if you're Matt Eberflus, and you already call a defense that's designed to keep everything in front of you, designed to force opponents to march the field, to work away from their wide receivers, throw underneath passes, put together long drives, score in the red zone, and you're able to do that against a young quarterback in Will Levis, what is your compulsion to be like, all right, go out there and sling it, Caleb Williams. We want to see if you can get 350 yards and 3 touchdowns and see if we can win this game 33-16, right? Like, I just don't see that happening. So he's probably going to put up a good game, but in order to put up a tournament winning game, he's probably going to need Tennessee to be pushing the scoring pace in this one. And I just don't see that being the likeliest outcome in this game. So I want to account for the fact that he's probably going to be more popular than he should be, that I want to not be totally dead in the water if he were to put up a shocking 35-point game. So I'm going to have some sharp stacks around him where it's like, what would this look like if you put up not a good score, but a tournament winning score, and then otherwise leave him alone?
All right, as we move to running back here, I do just want to mention again the programming schedule for this show. This one is posting early. Jam and I recording this earlier in the week because of my travel schedules. Regularly, though, going forward, this show will be live on Friday afternoons at 1 p.m. Eastern. So if you guys want to come hang out in the chat, we'll occasionally get to some questions, but we got a lot on our agenda each week. But you guys can always tune in, watch this live. I'll also post the audio on the In a Vacuum podcast feed. And also a good time to remind you, 1 Week Season has a bunch of podcast feed. You guys post a lot of your DFS content on there. Jam, let people know, as far as I know, the Edge audio just went up today. How much of that is behind the paywall? How much is that free for people?
Yeah, all of that's free. So NFL Edge is our game-by-game breakdowns. We look at coaching tendencies and how these teams match up, less about the metrics of this individual player matchups and more about the macro of the game. And so that's free every week on 1 week season, but also the Edge audio goes up typically Friday mornings. It's already up right now because, it's week 1. So every game broken down top to bottom. So you can find that. You can find my Q&As on there, find my Angles pod on there on Friday. So 1 week season on your favorite podcast player.
All right, let's move to running back. I don't know if it's just a week 1 thing. I don't know if it's kind of the unique dynamics of how the league is shifting right now, but it just seems like a very deep pool of running back options this week. As far as guys projected to get a decent amount of touches, we can kind of now get into the nitty gritty of how many of them are actually attractive and can give us the tournament winning scores we need. But what's kind of your macro overview of this running back slate?
Yeah, you said the thing about get us the scores we need. This is kind of interesting, right? There's so many guys 6,300 and below that the for the most part, the days of the 80%, 85% running back are gone. The guy who's going to play almost every snap, that's mostly gone. There are very few situations where we have that. So we've adjusted over the last few years to like, okay, now most NFL teams, and we've adjusted because NFL teams have adjusted. Most NFL teams give their lead back about 65% of the touches. And so there was a while there where people were paying 70, 800, 8K for a 65% running back. And you've got all these 65% running backs down in like the 6K, low 6Ks, mid to high 5K price range. And it's like, well, are these guys that much more talented that with the same workload, they're worth this much more money, right? Now we've kind of seen the prices skew down. And then the question becomes like, yeah, you've got so many guys 6,300 and below who are going to play about 65% of the snaps. They're going to see 15 to 20 touches. Most of the time, 15, 16 touches. Every once in a while, 20 touches. And then it's like, which one's hit for ceiling? It really almost becomes, almost none of them are going to go for 100 rushing yards. It really almost becomes which one of them falls into the end zone. So down at the cheaper end, the guys who really stand out from that pool as like higher probability, higher floor, more chances for touchdowns are Rachaad White and James Conner, just because those guys really are like 80% running backs. These guys are going to be the guys who are on the field most plays. So those guys really stand out to me down in the lower ends of the price range. I think Devin Singletary is really interesting because he has potential to have that same type of role, and people aren't really going to be keeping an eye on him. Javonte Williams, I think about how is Denver going to try to win this football game, and you're going to have this kind of mix and match. You're going to have probably an emphasis on Cortland Sutton. Then you're going to have kind of a mix and match of pass game pieces behind that, and then a heavy emphasis on the running backs. And so Javonte Williams, only 5,500, probably a 65% running back or even 60% running back, not one of these 80% guys, but because of his big play upside and his price tag, I think he's really attractive. And then there's a whole other bucket of guys, 6,300 and below, who are all kind of on the fringes of my list. So we won't touch on all of them individually, but just to say, like, there's a lot of guys down here that you can make cases for. And then up top, I think the most attractive ones up top, Jonathan Taylor, Bijan Robinson. Bijan Robinson, not totally yet. I'm not sure I'm going to handle the Falcons offense. If I have enough room for exposure, I'd love for the Falcons offense to be one of those pieces of mine where it's like I'm mixing and matching Drake London, Bijan Robinson, and Kyle Pitts across like 70% of my rosters, and just knowing that I'm getting solid points from somewhere in that offense. It'll be a concentrated offense. It should be a really good, high-functioning offense. But I'm not sure if the exposures will work out for that. But Bijan Robinson, just in the standpoint of like Atlanta's going to put together some points. They're going to focus through the offense through these three guys. And then Jonathan Taylor, really overpriced for his typical ceiling because he doesn't catch a lot of passes, but he is one of these guys who it's like you want to have a little bit of exposure to him because he can go for 32, 35 points, and maybe no other running back does that this week.
One thought on the Bijan, and you mentioned some of the pass catchers, not to get too far away from running back. What is your thought on like the pace of this game? Obviously, I'm so scarred from Arthur Smith games and slowing it down and really bleeding the clock. Do you think this game could feature, tournament winning scores, or do you worry about the overall play volume being muted and kind of a slog?
Yeah, I mean, coaches coach to the talent that they have on hand, right? Desmond Ridder just got cut trying to be the backup quarterback of the Cardinals, and that's who they were dealing with as the starting quarterback. We look back to Ryan Tannehill, who was probably Ryan Tannehill joining the Titans was probably a lower tier quarterback than Russell Wilson, even at this point in his career. And Ryan Tannehill, AJ Brown, Derrick Henry, we had so many weeks where the Titans were putting up 40 plus points, right? It was like 4 or 5 times throughout the season where they would have these monster games. And so even this Arthur Smith, stretching the defense horizontally, that type of system, we've seen it with Kevin Stefanski's offense over the years. Every once in a while, these 40-point games where they just kind of catch a defense off balance, are able to put up points. So no, I think that the likeliest outcome for this game is kind of like a 24-20 type of game, but there's potential on both sides for the scoring to be pushed in such a way that it ends up being higher scoring than that. So this is a game that I'm not totally crossing off of my list. And I just think that in terms of a concentrated offense with really good weapons, there's a good chance that one of these three guys ends up putting up 25 plus DraftKings points.
We talked about Bijan. You mentioned Rachaad White. The other guy that I think people are going to gravitate to in a big way would be Alvin Kamara. You get 6,700. Seems like very little in the way of other backfield competition. How are you kind of comparing him to maybe someone like a Rachaad White? I guess there's some kind of comps there, stylistically, price range, overall environment.
Yeah, you know what? So I made my running back notes 2 nights ago, and last night I went through kind of initial quarterback and wide receiver exposures, and haven't circled back around on running backs. Kamara's kind of off my list, but kind of shouldn't be. So yeah, that's one of those guys who, as I get deeper into the week and kind of this quarterback that we'll get in the building block was also one of these guys that I'd done all my research game by game, kind of built my list of what's sharp, and then I was going through all the players to see if I'd missed anything, and it was like, oh my gosh, I'm totally missing this guy, and everybody's going to miss this guy. So Kamara, not one that everybody's going to miss, but one that I've been kind of missing. Had him on my initial list. I think I made some note of why I took him off, but that was before I got deeper into the running back pool. So yeah, definitely a sharp play there. That's an interesting game too, right? Because we think we know what Bryce Young is, but we don't necessarily know what Bryce Young is. We do know what Derek Carr is, and what Derek Carr is a really good quarterback, except when he doesn't have protection. Well, his offensive line isn't good, but Carolina doesn't have a good pass rush. So yeah, I mean, I think it's a very interesting spot where we could see fireworks in that game. Kamara could be part of that.
I'm going to throw 3 names at you because I'm going to put them in like a thematic bucket of, explosive, maybe more boom bust type rushers who could either kind of sink or help you swim. Kenneth Walker, Devon Achane, James Cook. Any interest in playing with fire with those guys this week?
Yeah, so James Cook had 2 games last year of, I think it was 2 games like 24 plus DraftKings points. Maybe it was 2 games like 28 plus DraftKings points. But he's not putting up the scores that people think he's putting up, right? And one of those big games that he had was a game in which Josh Allen completely posted a dud. It might have even been both of James Cook's games, big games, came when Josh Allen disappointed. So I'm going to be playing James Cook as leverage off of my Josh Allen rosters, as in like, I would not isolate James Cook and say, hey, I'm going to play this guy. He's high probability, high ceiling. But if my Josh Allen rosters fail, it's probably not because the Cardinals shut down the Bills. It's probably because James Cook was getting those points. So I'm going to have some James Cook as leverage off of. It's going to say, look, if this chunk of Josh Allen rosters gets broken, I'm going to benefit in another area because of that. Devon Achane, I thought it was silly that he was being drafted in the second round of best ball drafts. That's just me. I think that he's still going to get this, 8 to 12 touch range most of the time. At the same time, this 8 to 12 touch, occasional 14, occasional 15 can also be enough for him to post a strong score. So I'm going to have some Achane, also some Mostert, but they're not going to be heavily featured on my rosters. Who was the other guy you mentioned? Oh, Kenneth Walker. Yeah, no, I mean, currently I don't have any Kenneth Walker. Maybe that'll change, but I just don't, I'm, it's a new offense, so maybe I should adjust my thoughts. I just don't typically take him. I mean, what did he last year? He put up 1 game north of 20.2 DraftKings points, and that's really the year before that. He had a couple like 30-point games when everybody was on him, but the rest of the time it was 16 to 18 DraftKings points. So his role is really, you're betting on those big plays, and that's less sustainable, and the floor is a little bit lower than what you get with some other guys. So I typically avoid him, but maybe I'll come around on that.
I think, there's so many good plays, even in the low 6s to mid 5s, just to kind of put a bow on running back this week. Is there anything like super creative you're doing sub 5.5, or do you just not need to get that cute this week? I'll mention guys like a Chuba Hubbard, a Tajay Spears, a Chargers running back, like anything there for you?
Yeah, I mean, those are the 3 spots where I'll be interested. Chuba Hubbard, just because he's probably going to get 65 or more % of the touches. Pair him with Deontay Johnson. You basically say, hey, if this offense does well, the points are going to be flowing through these 2 guys. The Tajay Spears, I think that Tennessee's going to rotate series, right, between Pollard and Spears. But realistically, when you rotate series, there's still one guy who ends up getting that 60% share. I think that's going to be Pollard, not Spears, but I'm willing to, I want to leave myself open to the possibility that I'm wrong on that. The Tajay Spears sees 60%. Also, Chicago, Matt Eberflus defense is very much all about most seasons at the end of the year, you look at a Matt Eberflus defense and they're near the top of the league in fewest receptions and yards allowed to wide receivers. So the defense is schematically designed to push passes toward running backs and tight ends. Well, the tight end here is Chigo Okonkwo, and then the running backs are these two pass-catching running backs. So certainly opportunity for Tajay Spears or Tony Pollard to emerge in this spot. And then I think J.K. Dobbins is really interesting just because of his big play upside. Coming off the Achilles injury, we know that typically saps explosiveness, but what if he is healthy, right? I want to ask that question as well. So, and this kind of backs up what we've been talking about. It's a very deep week one pool. So you have kind of a couple options. You can either say, let's say you're building, 20 plus rosters. You can either say, all right, I'm going to cut out a lot of attractive options. Know I might be wrong and just kind of narrow my focus onto a few spots. Or I'm going to pick a few kind of staples and hope that I'm right on these. So then I can mix and match lots of things around these staples and hope that I'm right on those. So we've gotten to one of my staples in Josh Allen. Bijan Robinson could be another staple just as part of this Falcons block, but right now it's not really on my list. And then I've got 3 other staples at wide receiver. And so I'll have kind of these higher exposures to these staples and then mix and match lots of pieces around that. So I know you can listen to something like this and it's like, well, this guy likes everybody. And it's kind of like, that's kind of the point this week, right? Is that this is a week, most weeks you listen to me in week 6 or 7 and you might be like, man, JM doesn't like anything this week, because some weeks are like that. And then you play to what the week provides. And this is just a week where it's like, man, there's a lot of different ways you can viably go in a plus EV fashion. So how do we maximize our chance of making money? To me, it's like, let me pick my highest confidence guys, get those on a lot of rosters, and then just throw lots of darts, lots of stacks, lots of different pass catcher combinations, running back combinations around that, and hope that my staples hit. And if they do, then I probably will have some combination around those staples that are putting me in really good shape.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of like the decision point, right? Because we kind of know the roles of the guys at the top end that we were talking about, JT, ETN, Rachaad White, Kamara. I think what's interesting is knowing, hey, there is some really or large amounts of ambiguity in some of these backfields, the Chargers being a perfect one. And it's like, one of these guys emerging as the clear-cut lead back, like, well, their price is going to be $1,000 more next week or going forward if that's kind of how it shakes out. So it is a little tantalizing to be like, hey, I could get in on the ground floor of one of these prices when they're never going to be this cheap the rest of the season.
Right. And then at the same time, maybe you're wrong, and then you're passing up on like some really clear and obvious guys who are just a little bit more expensive. So there's that balance there. And that's why the question of like, what do you win? Like, what is J.K. Dobbins' ceiling? Is it high enough to justify the risk that we're taking on when there's a lot of certainty in other spots? He would need to put up a 26 to 30 point game. So you have to ask, can he put up a 26 to 30 point game? How often can he do that? Probably not very often, because you would have to think that Gus Edwards is going to get a lot of the goal line work. You got to think that Justin Herbert's your quarterback. You're still going to lean on him down in the red zone some. And so, J.K. Dobbins becomes one of those guys where it's like, ooh, this is really attractive. How attractive is it? How much am I missing out on if he has his big game and I don't have him? Can I still win without that, right? And so he becomes one of those guys where it's like, yeah, I want some exposure, but not a ton. Like, he doesn't make it into that tier of guys I'm just heavily leaning on. But you still want to be thinking about those types of guys on a week like this, because week one, there's just so many things that people are going to overlook. You get those opportunities to win.
We're going to move on to wide receiver here in a sec. I wanted to mention a couple programming notes for my other DFS content. So I do 2 premium shows a week for YouTube members. I'm not going to have a DFS After Dark this week. I am going to be traveling back from Vegas, but regularly on Saturday nights, I'll bring a friend from the DFS space in. We'll talk about a variety of topics, end up building a lineup, always a chill hang on a Saturday night to get you in that lineup building mindset. And then Sunday AMs, I do a cram for the YouTube members. If you guys are hand builder and Opto Bro tier, at 10:30, I run through the slate, kind of final thoughts. We'll get the Schefter bombs overnight, updated ownership, see where the field is going. We'll check in on news and inactives when that comes in at 11:30 Eastern as well. Kind of your one-stop shop to get you ready for lock there. So become a YouTube member for $7.99 a month. It ends up being 8 premium shows a month there between After Dark and the Cram. JM, let's head to wide receiver. We hit on a few of the plays as it kind of pertained to maybe some stacks and some game spots. But as always, so many options, so many different avenues here at wide receiver. What was the first thing that caught your eye, whether pricing or just kind of macro dynamics here?
Yeah, so lot of depth, right? We kind of talked about that. And if you're looking at a lot of potential quarterbacks, a lot of game environments that could skew toward the upside, then that gives you a deep list. So once again, this is where my mind started really working toward, okay, who are my core guys that I can build around as staples? And if I'm right on these guys, and ideally when you're looking at a staple, you want it to be a guy who, if you're wrong, it doesn't kill your rosters, right? Ideally, it's a guy who has a pretty high floor, but also has a high enough ceiling that if you're right on these guys, they can actually be difference makers and you're way ahead of the field. And so if I can get all three of these guys right, even just from a floor perspective, then I'm ahead of the field with my mixing and matching from there. But if one or two of these guys hits for a huge game or the smile of heaven shines on me and all three of these guys hit for a big game, well, then all of a sudden, like, I'm so far ahead of the field because I'm mixing and matching lots of different pieces around that. So for me, those guys are Tyreek Hill, pretty obvious, right? He's going to be a focal point in that offense. And regardless of what Jacksonville is able to do, right? Miami's capable of winning 34-17. They don't need Jacksonville to really push the pace in order for Tyreek Hill to have a big game. 9 of his first 12 games last year, which you have to assume that's when he's at his healthiest. 9 of his first 12 games last year, he went for 26 or more DraftKings points. So Tyreek Hill is one of these staples. The other two are going to be a little bit more surprising. And they both fall into the same bucket of, at worst, they're the number 2 wide receiver on their team. And potentially they're the number 1 wide receiver with one of the top quarterbacks in the NFL, and they're cheap. So when we talk about this floor to ceiling range, you're talking about guys who their ceiling is excellent production as a number 1 wide receiver with a really good quarterback. Their floor is consistent usage as a number 2 wide receiver with a really good quarterback. Those guys are Khalil Shakir, who I think is, I've been a big Khalil Shakir fan since his rookie year. I've been talking about him since then. Every time he gets opportunities, we see him produce. Josh Allen has talked about Khalil Shakir really providing what Cole Beasley used to provide and what he hasn't had in a while. We look at some of those old Josh Allen blow-up games with Cole Beasley. A lot of the time, Cole Beasley was the guy hitting on that. Khalil Shakir more explosive than Cole Beasley. I look at Curtis Samuel as being a guy who's going to be used in kind of that matchup type game where they're going to say, here's a trick play, or here's a little design touch for Curtis Samuel, right? He ends up getting these 12 to 18 points a lot of time, but not the guy you're using downfield in a traditional wide receiver role. Obviously, Dalton Kincaid, a lot of the upside there, and then Keon Coleman, rookie in his first game. So I really look at Khalil Shakir as the guy who's going to emerge here, and at worst, he's going to be that number 2 weapon, getting a decent number of targets. And the other guy is Ladd McConkey, who I think is just going to go wildly overlooked. And we know what Josh Palmer is. And I'll talk about this offense a little bit more later and why our perception of them are skewed, but we know what Josh Palmer is. Josh Palmer is like a really solid number 2 wide receiver. If you're a playoff contender, but you're kind of strapped for cash and you've got an elite number 1, you don't have the money for a great number 2, you're gonna be like, man, we got Josh Palmer. That's pretty solid, right? But he's not going to emerge as a complete alpha. Ladd McConkey's ceiling is not to be a Justin Jefferson or a Tyreek Hill or a Devontae Adams, but his ceiling is to be kind of what Josh Palmer is to the number 2 wide receiver spot. Ladd McConkey can develop into a really solid number 1 wide receiver. And we've looked at, I'll talk about this again a little bit more later, but we've looked at Justin Herbert as, they brought in Greg Roman and they're not going to pass the ball as much. Like, Justin Herbert's still your quarterback. You're still going to throw the ball 32 to 35 times almost every game when Justin Herbert's your quarterback. Maybe he's not throwing 40 to 42 anymore, but you're still going to throw it, 30, 32, 33, 35 times. And when he's doing that, realistically, Ladd McConkey and Josh Palmer are 9.9K combined. That's not much more than Justin Jefferson or Tyreek Hill, right? And there's actually a little bit more value in getting 2 spots correct. It's about getting floor and ceiling with a chunk of salary is how we win tournaments. And so, how often are these two going to combine for fewer than 13 or 14 targets, right? Like, it's going to be so rare that these two combine for fewer than 13 to 14 targets, and they're going to have plenty of 18 to 20 to 22 target games between the two of them. And so then you kind of split that in half and say, man, Ladd McConkey is really undervalued. So I expect that fast forward 5-6 weeks into the season, I would expect Josh Palmer to be kind of priced in the high 5Ks as opposed to the low 5Ks. I would expect Ladd McConkey to be priced in the low 6Ks instead of the high 4Ks. So you get really nice value here. Floor is high because he'll get some usage regardless, and the ceiling is there as well.
Yeah, that's Yeah, that's an interesting take there too. And it kind of dovetails with, how to play these wide receivers. And some of them are going to maybe take some time to earn their spot on the depth chart. That has always been the selling point with Ladd, right? I mean, like no competition for targets. So if anyone could hit the ground running, it would be him. Let's hit on some other situations. We are recording this on Wednesday afternoon. As of right now, it is still completely up in the air whether Jamar Chase is actually going to play. Maybe could talk through it through both directions. I assume T. Higgins would be massively popular at 6,100 if Jamar Chase doesn't play. How are you kind of handling that spot as of right now?
Yeah, we can touch on it quickly. It's still a bad matchup or not a great matchup, game environment, etc. But if T. Higgins is the number one, like he probably goes for 14 or 15 points in a bad game. And you look at the other guys priced around him and you say, how many of these guys are going for 14 to 15 points in a bad game, right? Not a lot of them. Maybe Drake London, but still the matchup game environment are kind of drawbacks there. And so, and then what's the ceiling on T. Higgins with Jamar Chase down on the field? The ceiling is 22 to 28 points. And so, I think T. Higgins will be a super sharp play. I think Andre Yoshivas will be popular at 3K. And that's one of those ones where I want to ask, what do you miss out on if he hits, right? Are you missing out on a 12 to 14 point game where it's like, oh, well, I can make up for that in other spots, or are you missing out on a 23 to 25 point game? Also, if he misses, what are you missing out on? Like if he misses, is he still getting 10, 11, 12 points? In which case you want to be at least even weight with the field in terms of exposure, possibly even overweight the field with exposure. And I kind of see Yoshivas stepping into this number 2 role, not in a great setup, but I see him as a guy who it's like, well, his bad game is still probably going to be 7, 8, 9 points. And his good game has potential to be like 15 to 18 points. And so that's a guy where I want to be just kind of at least even with the field and not overthink it. If Jamar Chase plays, I'm probably leaving this offense alone altogether because it'd be hard for Jamar Chase he can post 30 points in any matchup. But his chances of missing in this spot, in this game environment, are going to be lower than normal, especially with no practice time. And his chances of putting up a score where if you don't have it, right, that's the two ways we think of things. What do you get when you have him? Like, what's the range when you have him? Okay, he could disappoint or get a 30-pointer if everything comes together. What happens if you don't have him? Like, can he put up a 40-pointer where you're like, God, I didn't have Jamar Chase. What was I thinking? I can't compete this weekend. Probably not, right? So I'm okay. If I lose because Jamar Chase puts up 40 points against the Patriots, I'm okay with that. So I'll leave this offense alone, probably just altogether if Jamar Chase plays.
We didn't talk about the Texans much. We kind of skipped over Stroud a little bit. Let's maybe talk about them through the lens of these wide receivers. You got Nico Collins at 7K. You got Diggs at 6,700 and Tank Dell down here at 5,500. How are you handling these guys?
Yeah, so first off, CJ Stroud, right? Our perceptions get skewed. You and I were talking before we went on air about the year that Clyde Edwards-Helaire had that monster game in week 1 on Thursday Night Football, and you guys did your high-stakes draft the next day, and so he was getting drafted at the top of the draft. And that one game that Clyde Edwards-Helaire had in his first career game on national TV, everybody's watching, like that stuck in people's heads for years. Everybody kept waiting for that game to be repeated, right? And it's interesting how our perceptions of players get skewed by those single data points. So CJ Stroud, a tremendous real-life quarterback. You know how many games he had north of 28 DraftKings points last year? 2, right? He's 7,500. It's like, what are we doing here? He cost 500 less than Josh Allen. He topped 28 DraftKings points twice. He had the 45-point game against Tampa, and that sticks in everybody's heads, and they're waiting for that to happen again. So CJ Stroud's not a guy that I'm paying 7,500 for because he needs the game environment to cooperate in order for him to have that monster game. Going to the wide receivers, though, even if we take out 3 guys hit in that Tampa game, well, in 9 of 17 regular season games, somebody from this Texans wide receiver group was hitting for a tournament winning game. And that was between Tank Dell and Nico Collins. And then when they were hurt, it was Noah Brown. And so the question is, does that still hold with 3 guys kind of as the weapons here? So the way I'm looking at that is I think my total exposure on that group of 3, Diggs, Tank Dell, and Nico Collins, my total exposure is going to add up to my exposure on Khalil Shakir, or my exposure on Ladd McConkey, or my exposure on Tyreek Hill. And so that's because there's probably a 40% chance, maybe take matchup into account. There's probably a 50% chance that one of these guys hits, but then you have to cut the likelihood if you assume that you have to slice that into 3 pieces in terms of how likely am I to get the right guy. Well, now you're saying there's a 17% chance that one of these guys hits. And so I feel like the certainty directionally is higher than most spots, but the certainty on individual pieces is lower. That second bet down the line cuts it down to being a little bit less plus EV, but I still want to get a lot of exposure to them. They're kind of in that second tier of pass catchers for me. And you want me to throw my second tier at you as well?
Yeah, throw it at
So
me.
my second tier, and this is kind of just mapped out last night, but so this could adjust a little bit. But right now, my second tier is Drake London, Nico Tank, and Diggs, Malik Nabers, Devontae Adams, Cortland Sutton, Mike Evans, Terry McLaurin. So we see all guys who are number one wideouts, capable of big plays, capable of piling up a lot of targets. Nabers, number one wideout. Devontae Adams, number one wideout. Cortland Sutton, Evans, McLaurin, and all of them can hit for big plays. All of them can conceivably see 10 to 13 targets. I'm going to have a lot of Chargers exposure because I'm going to have some leverage off my McConkey with Josh Palmer. So I want to get some Raiders on the opposite side of that because people aren't going to be on Devontae Adams. And so is he as likely as some of the other guys to hit a big game? No, but how much more valuable is it when he does? He can go for 40 points. He can go for these head-to-head types of scores, and people won't be on him. So that's kind of my balance of some of these guys are a little bit more obvious, a little bit more popular. Some of them are getting their ownership bumped up specifically because they won't be as popular, but that's kind of my second tier of wideouts.
Yeah, I'm looking here trying to see if there's anyone that's a notable omission from your tier 1, tier 2. I guess one spot I would highlight would be the Jags wide receivers. Kirk, Gabe Davis, Brian Thomas. We mentioned that potentially being a nice game environment. Any thoughts on that trio?
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to have some of them because I'm going to have a lot of Tyreek Hill, right? But they're kind of more trail bets to my Tyreek Hill than guys who I'm really isolating and going at. Also left Justin Jefferson off the list. So Justin Jefferson, really interesting. I already mentioned them, and I have a lot of Sam Darnold. Kind of an interesting note is that over the last 2 seasons, Jefferson has 15 games of 26 or more DraftKings points. Okay. In 10 of those 15 games, his quarterback scored 22 plus. And then another couple, they had high teens, right? So basically when Jefferson hits, his quarterback's usually hitting 22 plus. That makes sense, right? And so when your quarterback is priced at 6,500, it's like, well, I don't necessarily need the quarterback. When the quarterback's priced at 5,200, it becomes one of these things that, like, if Jefferson hits, that quarterback's probably hitting for a really nice salary considered score as well. And so you want to have like a lot of your Jefferson paired with Sam Darnold. So I kind of skipped over him because I'll have high exposure on him, but not in isolation. It'll be like a lot with Sam Darnold and then just a little bit without Sam Darnold.
Down at kind of the cheap end, you mentioned Yoshi Voss. I think he'll be popular even if Chase does play, and then very popular if he doesn't. There actually isn't a lot of, super obvious value late, which is kind of surprising when you think these salaries were set so long ago. We mentioned some of the rookie wide receivers down there, sub 4K. Is there anything else that you think can, kind of facilitate maybe some of this studs and duds approach? Because we have talked about a lot of expensive guys, Anthony Richardson, Allen, JT, Tyreek Hill. You might need some value to squeeze these guys in.
Yeah. And I'm going to have a lot of 5K to low 6K running backs. I'm going to have a lot of Lad McConkey and Khalil Shakir, 4,900 and 5,100. So there's certainly, and a lot of my roster are going to have cheaper quarterbacks as well. Tight end isn't really that expensive this week. So there's a lot of flexibility on salary without going all the way down. And like you said, it's an interesting week in that there's not a lot of cheap guys that have just, stood out as like super high end, high floor ceiling types of bets. So some guys who, not from the floor perspective, but from a perspective of this guy could win you a tournament and they're sub 5K. Jackson Smith-Njigba, I wrote down like 9 catches for 130 yards could happen. Weird things like that happen week 1, where it's like all this buzz around JSN taking the next step forward. And it's like, you want to be there before he shows it on the field. You want to be wrong because you're too early as opposed to too late. So he's the type of guy who, he could be one of the stories of week 1. He can come out and have this big game and everyone's like, oh, he's the alpha on Seattle now. It's like, well, maybe he's not, but he's going to have a few of those big games throughout the season. Rachaad White, number 2 wide receiver on the Saints, like fully all in, number 2 wide receiver, going to be playing probably about 70% of the snaps, can score from anywhere on the field. So yeah, a couple guys like that. Rome Odunze is kind of in that 3rd tier for me. Shaheed's in that 3rd tier for me. Rome Odunze is in that 3rd tier. JSN's in that 3rd tier. Of guys I want to get exposure to that have ceiling, but they also have lower floors than some of these other guys I'm looking at.
All right, let's move over to tight end. Last year we were always a little hurried when we got to tight end.
Yeah, I don't mind that.
gloss over it. Yeah, we still don't have to give it a ton of time, but we are going to give it its own section this year. But your disdain, I felt myself. I was doing some of the battle royale drafts earlier, and it's like, man, it gets gross really quickly here. How are you thinking about tight end? Because again, I guess similar to some of these other positions, there isn't like any super obvious, value that you need to gravitate to.
Yeah, and I think the danger can be, like we talked about with running back, right? The danger can be going cheap, and you're like, well, you're really not saving that much, and like your range of outcomes on these cheap guys is like 8 to 14 points, or like a bad game of 4 points, and hopefully they get you 14. Whereas the guys in the 4K, low 5K price range, like, well, some of them are going to score 20 points this week, or at least a couple of them are going to score 20 points this week. So I want to avoid getting too married to the value, because somebody in that like just tier right above the value is probably going to put up a nice game, and you want to make sure that you have exposure to that nice game wherever it comes from. Cheaper guys, you can make a case for Zach Ertz. You can make a case for Dawson Knox. I don't know. Tell me who else. Is there anybody else down here? Chigo Okonkwo in this matchup that filters targets to tight ends, but you don't know how he's going to be used in that offense. That's really what I see under 4K. Am I missing anything?
I mean, you mentioned Ertz. The other, like a gross one, would be like a Johnny Munt with TJ Hawkinson out there. I mean, I can get gross, but nothing.
So many plays for Johnny Munt.
I would mention again with the Chase stuff. Maybe Mike Gesicki gets a usage bump there. I could see that, but yeah, it's not pretty, Jam.
Yeah, and then you kind of get up, even when you get up to these other guys, it's like, oh, you know what? Probably one of these guys goes for 18 to 20 points, and if one of these guys goes for 18 to 20, these kind of 4K and above guys, like if one of them goes for 18 to 20, somebody in tournament's going to have them on their roster, and you're going to be chasing those people. So you want to make sure you're that person who has them on your roster so that people are chasing you. But I don't know who that's going to be, right? I think that Pat Freiermuth is always kind of a viable option. Brock Bowers at 4,500, especially opposite Ladd McConkey. And if I have any Justin Herbert, then Brock Bowers is a very interesting bring back there. Kyle Pitts is kind of part of that Falcons block of players that I'll cycle through. Dalton Schultz as like a little bit of leverage off those Texans wide receivers, although I don't think he had a 30-pointer last year in that game where 3 Texans players hit, where CJ Stroud went for 45 points. But, other than that, it's all kind of sub 20 points. So his chance of hitting one of those 20-pointers not particularly high. Evan Ingram, because I want exposure to this Jags offense, and I'm not going to get a ton of it through the wide receivers. So Evan Ingram fits in nicely there. Dalton Kincaid with my Josh Allen. David Njoku, but probably I'll have like a small amount of Cowboys Browns builds this week, and he'll be specific to those builds and not really bleeding off of those. And then Trey McBride. What's one of the beautiful things about Josh Allen and the Bills, as we kind of alluded to earlier, is you don't need the opponent to do well in order for Josh Allen to hit. And so that almost makes Josh Allen with no bring back that much more plus EV, because people are so conditioned to playing a bring back that it's not about predicting what's going to happen, just understanding like how frequently Josh Allen with no bring back is going to be more optimal than Josh Allen with a bring back. And so let's say that 60% of the time, no bring back is more optimal, but people only play that on 10%, 15% of the roster. So it's just plus EV to play a lot of Josh Allen, no bring back. But where there are bring backs, I'm going to have some Marvin Harrison Jr. I'm going to have some Trey McBride. So that kind of covers the tight end position. Like there's nothing at the tight end position that I'm saying I'm playing this guy because I really like him this week. Yeah. It's more just like, how do I balance this off my other plays, or how do I mix and match things off these game environments is probably how I will be approaching the position.
Real quick, because you mentioned it with Njoku, and I kind of realized, we haven't really talked about Dallas and Cleveland otherwise. Didn't mention CD, didn't mention the running backs. Are we worried that this game is going to just be kind of a slog? It has a really low total. Like if you looked at the total, you would be surprised. I feel like most people would guess like a 45, 46. I think it's at a 42-point total, which seems weird for the talent that's in this game.
Yeah, I mean, Deshaun Watson hasn't shown anything at quarterback. Brandon Cooks hasn't shown anything as a number 2 wide receiver. Ezekiel Elliott and Rico Dowdle are the running backs for the Cowboys. The offensive line isn't what it used to be. So I see this game probably being low scoring, but it's one of those games. The Browns under Kevin Stefanski have had this tendency to have these random 42 to 36 games. And it's like, you've got this great defense, and there's no reason why you should have these high scoring games, but this defense is really aggressive, and that leads to some big plays from the opponent. So I'm not looking at that game as a place to pull one-offs from, but I am looking at that game as, okay, 6 to 8% of my builds, right? Probably 6% of my builds split between Deshaun Watson and Dak Prescott, and just say, this game could shoot out, and so I'll have some isolated bets on the idea of this game shooting out. And then outside of that, I'm not going to have a bunch of Amari and CeeDee Lamb and David Njoku spilling away from those rosters. That'll all be concentrated on those very specific storytelling builds.
That makes sense. I think it is time now that we have hit on all of the positions to do what everyone loves, and that's to watch us build a team here on DraftKings with some of JM's favorite building blocks. Let's get our minds right. All right. As always, I got the Deposit Kingdom Weekly League pulled up. Our friends over at DraftKings have hooked us up again for a Deposit Kingdom Discord only league. The only place to find the link to this is in the announcement section of the Deposit Kingdom Discord. I posted that in there, depending on when you're watching this, on Wednesday. As of right now, we have 114 of 300 spots. It's a single entry tournament, $10, completely rake free. So anytime you are trying to build a bankroll, anytime you are trying to seek out, solid contests, finding the ones that have no rake is an awesome place to start. And JM, speaking of awesome places to start, I feel like you've teased it a little bit throughout the show. I kind of think I know where you're going here.
Yeah, I think you know where I'm going with this.
Yeah, what are we kicking this off with?
So let's start here. So on X the other day, formerly Twitter, I wrote, I just found a block of players for week 1 that is so obvious, but is going to go so overlooked. It has the feel of one of those plays that will A, fail to hit in week 1, and then B, catch steam and be really popular and probably hit in week 2 or 3. But man, if it hits in week 1. Okay, so over 50 guesses came in. Nobody guessed it, which shows just like how overlooked it is. And some people ask like, oh, is it because of the matchup? That's why you think it won't hit in week 1? Or no, it has nothing to do with that. It's not about the matchup. It's just like one of those things where like, I just know how these things go. Don't play this stack, okay? Like, it's not going to hit in week 1. I'm going to play it, but it's not going to hit in week 1. And then like a few weeks into the season, people are going to be like, man, these 2 wide receivers combined for so many targets. We should all be getting on this. And the week when everybody gets on it, it's going to hit. It's going to look so obvious and justify the fact that people were like, wait, why is JM on this in week 1? This has happened multiple times in week 1 in the past, by the way. So it is Justin Herbert and Ladd McConkey and Josh Palmer. And
right,
I want to explain A, why this is good just from a raw points perspective, but B, why it's such a plus EV bet. So all this, like humans, we evolved, our minds relate to story, right? That's how we learned things. That's how we survived. That was before math. That was before language was stories. That's how we connect with things, right? And so our decision-making is typically triggered by emotions, which are triggered by stories. And the stories around the Chargers throughout the offseason is, oh, they drafted Joe Alt with this top pick. They got rid of Keenan Allen. They got rid of Mike Williams. They brought in Greg Roman. So all the thoughts around this is like, oh, this is going to be a run-heavy team. Like Tyrod Taylor in 2015 and 2016 threw the ball 35 to 39 times all the time with Greg Roman as his offensive coordinator. And that's Tyrod Taylor. Like there's still going to be a lot of games where Justin Herbert throws the ball 40 times. There might actually be some games where he throws the ball under 30 times. That might happen. We would not have seen that in the past. But on average, he's still going to come out to this 33 to 35 pass attempt range throughout the season. And so if he hits for, well, actually, so that's the first part. Is like, you've got a top quarterback. I remember watching PFF was doing their win totals podcast this summer. And they kept talking about like, if you have an elite quarterback, that's worth 10 wins. And then like the pieces around it, you make your decision from there. And then we get to Justin Herbert and everyone's just like, they've got Greg Roman as their offensive coordinator. Like you've got Justin Herbert. Like this is still a Justin Herbert offense. Okay. So Justin Herbert still going to throw 33, 35 times a lot. So this is why this bet is so plus EV. We've talked a lot this podcast about the second bet down the line, right? Directionally, you get Texans wide receivers right. But even if you get it right 50% of the time, you still have only a 17% chance of getting the wide receiver right because the second bet down the line gets spread out. If Justin Herbert, well, let me say it like this. Is Justin Herbert more likely than some other quarterbacks on this slate to throw for 350 yards and 3 touchdowns? No. There's some other quarterbacks on this slate who are more likely to do that. But if Justin Herbert throws for 350 yards and 3 touchdowns, it's pretty hard to paint the picture of it coming through Quentin Johnston and Hayden Hurst and Will Dissly. You know, like if he's throwing for 350 and 2 or 352, 353, we know with a high level of certainty that those are likely to come through Ladd McConkey and Josh Palmer. So because that the first bet is, say, we'll just pick out numbers, right? Let's say the first bet on something else is 30% likely to hit, but then you got to split it 3 ways after that. So you're 10% likely on that second bet to get everything right on a roster. Let's say that Justin Herbert's only 20% likely to hit, but you're 90% of the time you're getting that second bet right, that it's coming through these two guys. So that's like 18% likely to hit as opposed to the 10% likely to hit in terms of what you're actually getting on your roster. So because of how likely that you are to get that second bet down the line correct, it makes this that much more plus EV. So really love this stack. It's one that I totally overlooked going through in my research. I was going through to see if I missed anything. And it was just like, Justin Herbert's kind of interesting. But Justin Herbert's really interesting. What if, I kind of started playing around with it and you realize like, oh, this is actually massively plus EV. It's less likely to hit than some other stuff, but it's actually more plus EV than the ones that are more likely to hit, and then amplify that much more because of how much people are just going to overlook it. And if it hits, which again, it probably won't in week 1, but if it hits, it's going to look so obvious after the fact. People are going to be like, oh man, Justin Herbert was only 5,800. I didn't realize that. Justin Herbert only had 2 wide receivers and they cost 9.9K combined. So again, what's probably going to happen is it won't hit. And then like week 3 or 4, a lot of fantasy writers are going to be like, man, Palmer and McConkey get 16 targets a game. Like this is going to hit at some point, and then people will pile on. But yeah, I really like this one this week.
All right, I love it. It does remind me of a bit of the kind of the vomit stack. A few was it last year when you had the
it was last year, and
Ritter?
I thought about this
London?
too, and I thought how funny last year was Desmond Ritter, Drake London, and Jonnu Smith, and I thought, you know what, Pete's going to bring up that vomit stack, and like how funny that Justin Herbert is like equating in our minds to Desmond Ritter and Jonnu Smith. It's just the state of things right now in week 1.
Well, the beauty of this, as you kind of outlined, the selling point here is all the salary. We have remaining just 5,800 for Herbert, 4,700 for Ladd, 52 for Palmer. So we still have 5,700 on average remaining for the rest of this lineup. What's the next direction we go here?
I think right now, let's go ahead and go with a couple of these cheaper running backs. I'm going to leave flexibility to go up from here, but let's go with, say, a James Conner and a Javonte Williams. And then that's also going to leave me flexibility to go Khalil Shakir opposite. So I'm going to think about if I'm doing my Bink machine builds, my optimizer builds, and I'm saying, well, I want to get a lot of Khalil Shakir. And so then if I'm getting James Conner on one of these rosters, I'd like to make sure that Khalil Shakir would be the guy that's going on that roster. So we can put Khalil Shakir on here as well. That also gives me a Ladd McConkey, Khalil Shakir pairing, which I'm going to have a lot of this week because it's this opportunity to bet on these 2 potential alphas with really good quarterbacks, and then still have a lot of salary left over. So what my goal is going to be here is to see if it's possible to get a Tyreek Hill or somebody like that, somebody with that level of upside and certainty in that flex spot, and see what that leaves us at tight end and defense, and if we can make it all work.
Yeah, it seems like we'll definitely be able to make this work. Yeah, we're in good shape. And like you said, we might be able to come up on one of these running backs here as well. Tyreek Hill, I think, is such an easy sell. The James Conner, I guess I'm curious too. I'm wondering, my guess is people will get maybe spooked off being like, hey, if they're on the road trailing in Buffalo, how is he getting there? But for you, is this like James Conner's just not coming off the field this
He's just not coming off the field. And you're still going like a blowout win isn't a blowout in the first and second quarter a lot of the times, right? And so Matt Milano missing on the Bills defense, which is a big loss, and a lot of turnover on the Bills defense. Jordan Poyer and Micah Hyde gone at safety on the Bills defense, and just an opportunity for James Conner to get the ball a lot, be on the field a lot. Carries are not as valuable as catches in DFS anyway. And so if they get blown out by the third quarter, fourth quarter, and so he's only getting 14 carries instead of 18 carries, that hurts me less than people tend to think, right? Because then he might go from 4 targets up to 6 targets, and then there's still those touchdown opportunities. On this roster, what we actually really want to do is we want to put a Raiders piece on almost all of these Herbert-led rosters. And so this is kind of a perfect place to drop in Brock Bowers at the tight end position. We're going to have a lot of money left over, but we can get whatever defense we want and then see what we want to do with that extra salary.
Yeah, talk about Brock Bowers a little bit. He was one of my favorite players to draft all season, my most drafted tight end. I was getting a little spooked about the foot injury. He missed some practices. I believe he's been back at practice. Obviously, you get this Q tag right here. Coach Antonio Pierce noted Thursday feels good about Bowers being on the field for the season opener. That was last week. but just kind of like expectations for him. A lot of people might say, man, rookie tight end, 4,500 already out of the gate. I guess this is both assuring me that my Brock Bowers love is justified, but also maybe for skeptics of like, I don't want to play a rookie tight end in his first career game.
Yeah, it's funny. The college game has developed so much that used to be quarterbacks come in and it takes them a couple, Peyton Manning threw 28 picks his rookie year. Quarterbacks come in and it takes them a little bit of time to adapt to the NFL game. And now we have guys like CJ Stroud who can reset the curve of what the expectations can be on a rookie quarterback. Used to be you never ever take a first rookie wide receiver in fantasy. And then Mike Evans and Odell Beckham blew up in their rookie years. And it was like, okay, these guys are actually coming into the NFL much more ready than they used to come into the NFL. So again, tight end's been a long-standing, tougher position to transition to the NFL. You don't play rookie tight ends in fantasy, but then Kyle Pitts kind of, even though he underperformed what people's expectations were his rookie year, he still set all sorts of rookie records for tight ends. And then last year we had Sam Laporta, Dalton Kincaid. So the tight end development has gotten to a point where these guys are able to come into the NFL game that much more quickly. And you have a lot of weapons on this offense that command defensive attention. So you don't have a great quarterback, and you don't have a team that philosophically necessarily wants to just air it out, but you do have a quarterback in Gardner Minshew who's a gunslinger. I prefer him over Aiden O'Connell in the spot in terms of just like taking shots and getting the ball to people. And if Davante Adams, let's say if Justin Herbert is putting up the type of game that wins you a tournament, well, that's forcing the Raiders to throw the ball more. And we know that Gardner Minshew can throw the ball 35, 40 times and put up 300 passing yards. And if the defense is putting attention on Davante Adams, and that means this is spilling over to Jacoby Myers, to Brock Bowers. So it just kind of loops into this game environment bet. I'll probably have a lot of Brock Bowers on Herbert rosters, probably not much off of Herbert rosters, but this tells this story of, okay, like Herbert is hitting some plays. The Raiders are getting aggressive in response to this game. This game environment is developing the way that we needed to develop for this.
All right, let's slot a defense in here. Like you said, then we'll, no matter what we do, even if we got up to say Cowboys, we would have some salary to play around with. We obviously didn't devote an entire section to defense, but I do know over at 1 week season and in your kind of final write up each week, you do give some of your player pool for defense. Did anyone stand out to you this week?
Nobody really stands out, right?
Yeah.
We do have some rookie quarterbacks, so that's an opportunity to look at things. And I think that we'll get a decent amount of, so this is kind of a macro thought. I think we get a decent amount of Caleb Williams ownership. And so taking Tennessee against Caleb Williams is interesting leverage. I don't think that's necessary on this roster because we're going to be so different from the field with Justin Herbert, but that's just something to think about is where we can get these, defenses going against rookie quarterbacks is going to have some value to us. Yeah, I don't really have anything that stands out to me on defense this week. I think the Giants are interesting against Sam Darnold, especially on rosters where I don't have Sam Darnold and Justin Jefferson. That's some leverage off that. In fact, yeah, let's go ahead and throw the Giants on because we have Tyreek Hill. So it's one of those thinkings that we want to think about, like our clearest path to first place is not just Tyreek Hill having a 35-point game, but Justin Jefferson putting up 22 points or 18 points, kind of underwhelming expectations. And so with this Tyreek Hill, no Justin Jefferson, we can say, hey, maybe the Giants defense has a big game and that takes away points from Justin Jefferson. And that helps our roster kind of doubly in this spot.
So does that mean maybe as far as like all the pieces fitting together, the story we're telling with this lineup is Javonte Williams kind of the logical guy to upgrade here with this extra $1,000?
Yeah, I mean, he doesn't fit into the story in any way, right? And so this gives us an opportunity to go up to, say, a Rachaad White, who we know he's going to get all the touches. We get this James Conner, Rachaad White pairing where, when you look at like the usage certainty, right? Like Khalil Shakir, if everything goes the wrong direction, he's still going to get like 6, 7, 8 targets, right? Lab McConkey and Josh Palmer, everything goes the wrong direction. They're still going to combine for about 14 targets. Rachaad White, James Conner, both should play about 80% of the snaps or more. Tyreek Hill is going to be heavily emphasized in the office. So we see that we've built, even though it's a unique roster that we've built where most people won't have this Herbert stack, it has a very high floor from a usage standpoint. And then it has a high ceiling because if guys are getting a lot of usage, then they have lots of opportunities to score touchdowns. So it just comes together as like a really nice balanced roster that's going to be lower owned, but also have the upside to win you a tournament.
Yeah. In this kind of, I do think on week one, you probably will see, I think a popular construction, and again, this is, I haven't been spending as much time in the weeds of DFS this week as I will in future weeks messing with lineup builds, but I'm guessing people are going to want to punt at tight end. They're going to want to take a cheap wide receiver, maybe one of the rookies, maybe a Yoshi Voss, and go a little more studs and duds. That's probably going to be how I think most people will want to approach it. So getting a really balanced lineup while still sneaking in, one of the best plays on the slate in Tyreek Hill, I think is just kind of a unique approach just from an overall roster building standpoint.
Yeah. And ideally, when we're being contrarian simply by thinking for ourselves. And so then you build something that you like, and then you're like, oh, this is also going to be contrarian. Ideally, we're not being contrarian by saying, okay, everyone else is thinking this, so we're going to think differently. This is the best way to be contrarian, is where you just say, hey, here's a set of players I really like. They come from my exposure ownership pool. They fit together nicely. They tell a good story, but also it's going to be very different from what other people are building from a construction standpoint and kind of the emphasis on certain players in here standpoint. And you also see like there's probably gonna be a lot of ownership on Rachaad White, maybe less so James Conner, definitely on Tyreek Hill. So it's not like we're just shying away from ownership, but just this construction is so unique that we have very clear paths to a first place finish. I mean, if we get one thing right, if Herbert and the Raiders kind of end up in a back and forth type of game, we are so far ahead of the field because we're probably getting the guys who benefit from that. And then we've got these other pieces mixed in from there who all have upside.
Yep, for sure. As I said, guys, this is the Deposit Kingdom Weekly League. I will be reviewing the winning lineups every Monday morning. I'll have the portfolio review. We'll go through DraftKings lineups, my underdog teams, all of that good stuff. So if you want to see your team featured there, hop in this contest. Like I said, the link is in the Deposit Kingdom Discord. The link to the Discord's down below. You can join there, go to the announcement section, find that link, and compete with all of us in the Deposit Kingdom. And JM, man, it feels so good to get one of these under our belts. Let the people know again this week. It's as easy as heading over to 1 week season. They create an account, but it's completely free, and they get to get the keys to the entire castle for week 1.
Yeah, you basically covered it. OWS free account, which also gets you access to other things throughout the season on the site. But week 1, everything's free.
Awesome. Yeah. Make sure you guys take advantage of that. I mean, the amount of people I hear from who, once they poke around, once they get to experience it and then say, holy cow, I can't imagine how I ever played DFS without it. I've heard that over and over again. So take advantage of the free week. There's literally no downside. You can see what JM and the squad do over there. Awesome ways of approaching and thinking about the slate. And then let the people know too, kind of your content schedule, the flow of how it goes. I'm a little rusty of when everything comes out throughout the week.
Yeah, so once we're in season, it'll be Thursdays or the NFL Edge. That's the game-by-game breakdown. By Thursday night, my DFS interpretations are in the NFL Edge. So that's my game-by-game thoughts on kind of what players are standing out to me and why. By throughout Friday, the rest of the DFS interpretations from the team come in. And then on Friday, the scroll, which Pete has up on the screen, starts populating. And so the scroll is basically just like all of our late week content, strategy content, player pools and whatnot, all in one space. And you can kind of jump to whichever article you want to on the side over there. So Friday, Saturday, the scroll starts getting populated. Friday on the 1 week season podcast feed is my Angles podcast. Friday is my podcast with Pete. Saturday morning for Inner Circle members is the Slate Strategy podcast with Xanamir and Hilo. And yeah, that about covers what you'll be looking for each week. But yeah, trying to make it easy on you guys. The two main places you need to go outside of podcasts are the NFL Edge for game-by-game breakdowns and the scroll for all your late week content. Hop in those two places each week. We'll have you covered.
Yep. I think we got you guys covered. I know a lot of you, like myself, transitioning from our best ball brain back into the world of DFS. So very much appreciate JM level setting us as we get ready for this week 1 slate. And like I said, next time we see you guys, we will be live on a Friday afternoon at 1 p.m. Eastern if you want to come hang out in the chat, or you can always catch us on replay. So for everyone, week 1, good luck. I will see you on Monday for the reviews. And like JM likes to say, we'll see you guys at the top of the leaderboard. Peace.